Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, PPK. I'm really happy to be here. I hope you are too. Yeah. So yes, I am old. Thanks, PPK. That was great. Yeah, I've been doing CSS, as he says, since about 1996, and seen a lot of things come and go in that time. And I remember early on, very early on, one of the things that we really missed in CSS was the ability to do fonts. The CSS1 specification itself said quite explicitly that setting fonts is one of the most common things that authors would do with CSS. And yet, it really didn't give them the ability to use their own fonts. It only lets you use whatever fonts were on the machine. And for years and years and years, authors, designers would say, you know, if we could do fonts, that would be awesome. And the working group would say, yes, we're working on that. Well, as most of you probably know, a few years ago, that ship finally sailed into the harbor, right? We finally got the ability to do fonts, to do our own custom fonts, download fonts and have them applied to web pages. So I want to look at some of the details of how that works and maybe some things that you haven't started working with yet, because there's some surprising depth in the @fontface rule. And so I'd like to look into that today. The first thing I want to do is talk about the bulletproof syntax, just for a minute. That is a brave gentleman right there. Okay, so hopefully some of you have seen this, or maybe even all of you. That would be even more awesome. This is what's currently thought of as the new bulletproof font face syntax that takes into account all of the various browser incompatibility problems that we're still living with, and having all sorts of different format fallbacks. So you have stuff in here like the .eot !octothorpe IE fix to make old versions of Internet Explorer not hork up a hairball and die. And then you start going into things like the web open font format and TTFs and SVGs if you roll that way. I feel like this is missing something. So in this example, I'm using obviously the family Switsera ADF, which is a free, as in open source, as a FOSS type free font that's available. And great. Just about anybody who comes to my site and loads this style sheet will also load one of these font files. But what if they already have Switsera? This does nothing to account for that, right? If they already have Switsera ADF installed on their machine, they're still going to have to download it from the site because it hasn't taken into account the fact that maybe it's local. So this is something, if you're using the bulletproof syntax, or if you're doing web fonts at all, I strongly encourage that you do. I don't care how obscure your font is, put in a local alternative first. Because if the user happens to have it, why make them download the file? Whatever file their computer is capable of handling, right? And you could potentially have multiple locals, so just in case, oops, sorry. I went too far. Stop it. Okay. All right, anyway, I'll just describe what I was supposed to be saying in the last slide. Have multiple local calls, so maybe one for Switsera ADF and one for Switsera ADF regular, because maybe when they installed the font, they decided to rename it. Now, obviously, you're not going to come up with every variant of the name for Switsera ADF, but you can come up with a few, right? Just a few alternatives. So you do that, because then, and this is a much reduced version of the bulletproof syntax so that it will all fit on the slide. Say, okay, if it's local, use it. If it's not local, download a file, whichever file you can handle, and then you can just very quickly, in your CSS, say the body, 1M Switsera ADF. Now, this is something that we're often encouraged not to do, right? By that I mean we're encouraged not to have a custom font that's applied to an entire page, mostly for performance reasons. And in the mobile space, I agree. Of course, PPK may shake his head and tell me that I'm wrong, and performance is much better now. But applying custom fonts to headings in handheld and mobile situations, that's okay. But like styling an entire article is probably going to really hurt the performance. But on the desktop, I'm not noticing that nearly as much. I'm getting to the point now where I hit a web page that's using custom fonts on literally every element in the entire page. And I don't see that much of a performance hit. It might take an extra second or two for the page to render, but we're not seeing that kind of performance hit. So this is a good case for media queries as far as I'm concerned, right? Use your awesome fancy fonts on desktop, but then in handheld, smaller devices, circumstances where that battery and performance are really major concerns, just use a sans serif or a serif. Use the generic fallback. So, once you've decided, however, that you're going to use this sort of syntax, you can actually do some interesting things. Now, some of you may own this shirt. I don't know. This was created by Koi Vin of Subtraction, also former design director at the New York Times. Maybe you agree with this shirt wholeheartedly. Helvetica is the greatest thing since things were invented. You can declare your loyalty using font face. Rename Helvetica. There you go, right? And it works. It's great. I don't know what you call it. I guess over here you call them Kinder eggs, but in the States we call this an Easter egg. For someone who looks at your source and goes, oh, dude, I have that shirt too. That's awesome, right? Of course, you could go the other way with this. Rather than making the name longer, you could make it shorter. Okay? So, I don't know how many times you're going to actually specifically say Helvetica. If you say it a lot in your style sheet and you have for some reason to actually need all those calls to Helvetica, maybe renaming it to be shorter will save you a few bytes. I don't know. There's something you have to watch out for, though. For the most part, I actually kind of recommend this. Come up with a short font. If you're coming up with if you're loading your own font, give it a short name, right? Sweatsera ADF, whatever, okay. But you need to watch out for something, particularly with Helvetica. And it's this. I found this not too long ago, and I'm going to look directly at the slides so that I get all this straight. So here's an example of the result of this test case in Windows specifically. Okay, so I said the first of these two families should be Helvetica. The first of these two tests should be Helvetica, and then the second should be in Arial. And if you look at them closely, okay, that's what happens. Awesome. You get Helvetica for the first one and Arial for the second. So far, so good. But if you rename them to, let's say, H and A, you don't get the correct result. You get all kinds of weirdness. So basically, from what I can tell, Windows maps Helvetica to Arial, but then if you rename it, you lose the association. I don't know why. If someone out there knows, if someone is a total expert on the Windows font system and can explain to me why that happens, I would be really grateful. Because I even wrote a blog, I know nobody reads blog posts anymore, but I did write a blog post about it. And a whole bunch of people came in and said, wow, maybe it's this, and it could be this other thing, and none of them are panned out. Nobody knew. So with Helvetica, be careful. Or if you're willing to accept Arial as a substitute, then rock on with your bad self. Personally, I am, but I am not a typographer. And I know that there are people in the audience who want to kill me now. But I can't tell the difference, okay? So I don't know what's going on with them. Yeah, so I just wanted to throw that out there before I start talking about adjusting the parameters of the font face. Basically adjusting font face descriptors. He's a lovely fellow. Okay, so If you've used font face at all, you discover that in the font face block, you can say things like font family, right? Like we saw font family, Switzer ADF. And then you can start mentioning the font weight and the font style and all these other things that are CSS properties. But in the block, they're not properties, they're descriptors, which took me a little bit to get my head wrapped around, I have to admit. So as an example, if we look at this little block of text here and this little block of CSS, okay, so I'm still working with Helvetica, but I'm going to substitute in this case, right? So I said font family Helvetica, source local Helvetica, great, whatever. I'm using Helvetica, go me. But then font family Helvetica, font stretch expanded, and the source for that, in this case, is Gotham Black, because I don't have an expanded version of Helvetica. So what I'm doing is I'm describing what should happen when, in the normal CSS, Helvetica is set to be font stretch expanded, which you can see over here. The body, I have 1M Helvetica sans serif, and then H1, I just said font stretch expanded. And so Gotham Black is substituted. Okay? So if you have need for some of these effects like font stretching, either expanded or contracted, you're not stuck with finding expanded or contracted versions of Helvetica, which I don't even know if those exist. Probably they do, because like everything is Helvetica now. But you can substitute something else, something that's close, right? And that has the visual effect you're looking for. It doesn't even have to come from the same font family, really. But because with these descriptors, you can make these substitutions. Similarly, font stretch condensed, I decided to substitute impact. Remember, again, not a typographer. So just work with me. That's the concept, right? So here, for the H2, I said font stretch condensed, and it used impact. Okay? And you can keep going with that. Maybe instead of impact, you might decide to use Futura condensed medium, or whatever. And then you can combine these, right? So you use one face if the font stretch is condensed, but another face if it's font stretch condensed and font weight bold. Okay? So that just keeps going and going and going, right? And so here, I have, 3, 4 font faces going on here, all from different families. And yes, to a certain degree, I can get away with this because I know that I have all of these faces local to my machine, so I don't have to worry about performance. But again, the concept here is that you can you can combine these descriptors in descriptive ways, strangely enough, so that you can have greater visual control. And you could take it this far. I know that's not really legible. It's okay. Having a base of Helvetica, but then substituting in a whole bunch of Futura alternatives or a whole bunch of Gotham Black alternatives, just by putting all these combinations together of, okay, well, if the font is condensed and it's bold and it's oblique, then use this face, and so on and so forth. You can really start to construct some very, very powerful, very rich font collections this way. And again, I will say, watch out for performance, right? Because if you make the user download a whole bunch of font files, then the user has to download a whole bunch of font files, right? And in some cases, that's not a good idea, like if they're on mobile. And in other cases, maybe it's not a good idea because who wants to sit there through all those downloads? But it's still something to keep in mind. So if you're going to go this route of substituting different font faces into your font family, there are actually some interesting tricks that you can do to make this happen. So I call this font substitution because I am not original. It's what anyone would call it, really. So as an example, you could say in my Helvetica font family, anytime the font weight is 100, I want to use Zapfino or some other fancy swashy cursive type font, and then I can swap out the first letter of every H1 just by setting the font weight to 100 and taking advantage of that font face descriptor to swap it out. So this is a comparison between WebKit, I guess, and Gecko, or Chrome and Firefox if you prefer. And great, that worked awesome. And of course, if it doesn't work for some reason, if somebody comes and visits with an older browser that doesn't understand this sort of thing, they'll just get Helvetica. They won't get the swashy first letter, but you know, they're not going to know any different, right? Because how many people besides us load a page in 2 different browsers? Nobody. Nobody besides us does that, right? I never get mail from people who come to my website saying, you know what, I loaded this site up in 3 different browsers and it looks slightly different. You suck, right? Well, I mean, not anymore. But besides, as Dan Cederholm asserted quite correctly in a website, do websites need to look exactly the same in every browser.com. And if you go there, it will tell you the answer. And if you go there in different browsers, it will tell the answer in different ways. So there you go. Now, this is great. Yeah, we can use font weight 100, first letter to swap out Helvetica for Zapfino. And you might think to yourself, wow, I could do that with other descriptors. And yeah, in theory, you could. However, this is what happens when you try to do it with font variant small caps. Well, if the slide advances, this is what happens. Sorry. If you try to do it with font variant small caps. Yeah. I don't know what Firefox is doing. They've just got, it's everywhere, right? Why would you do that? I don't know. It gets worse, though. Not small caps, that's bad enough. However, when I used font stretch, then Chrome did this thing that it did where it's applied Zapfino to the thing that it wasn't even styling. The H1 is all Helvetica. The paragraph is in Zapfino. What? I don't know. Like, I have lots of bugs to file. That's what I got from this. I have lots of, like, yeah, go to Bugzilla. Well, Tab's sitting right there. Maybe he can file some for me. No, not so much. Yeah, he's not going to do my work for me. Damn. All right, maybe next time. Okay, so it's a great concept. And it works fine for font weight, but not so much for other things. And I wish I could explain that. But hopefully, one day, we will no longer be cutting our throats on this particular bleeding edge of technology. It will all be fixed, and it will be fine. So, still, it's kind of a useful trick. I've used it on occasion to, at least in tests, to not swap out like swap in a swashy font, but as an example, to take Helvetica and then swap in a Gotham first letter. Sometimes can be very nice. Now, you can take this whole swapping thing even further, at least again in theory, with Unicode Range, which is really kind of fun. Now, how many of you, just by a show of hands, want to hurt me for this slide? Come on, let it out, because it's going to be worse in just a second. How's that? How you like me now? Yeah, uh-huh. Yeah. Guess what? That's all the same text. I just changed the style sheet. And this is not actually one font. It's a collection of several fonts, where I used Unicode Range to substitute in faces. Yeah. I live to hurt. Right? So, like every 5th letter, just doink, 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 doink. So, yeah, Onyx and Lucida handwriting and marker felt and so on and so forth, right? That's how I ended up with that. When you look at the source, it's just straight text. There's no spans, there's nothing in there. It's just using Unicode Range to swap out each of these letters. So this leverages, actually, to some degree, I mean, all of this leverages this mechanism, but the way that the font resolution mechanism works is really fairly complicated. And I don't know how many of you have ever actually sat down and thought about it. For most of you, it's not your job, so you don't think about it, but basically the way that text is rendered, well, part of the way text is rendered, is that the browser, when it comes to every individual character, it says, okay, I'm supposed to be rendering this character in this particular font face. Does this font face have that character? Is this glyph available? And if the answer is yes, great, I'll plop it down. And if the answer is no, I'll go to my fallback, whatever my fallback is. So when you do your list of fallback fonts, right, when you say Helvetica, comma, Arial, comma, Gotham, Bold, comma, whatever, the browser actually uses that every time it can't find a symbol for the character you told it to put on the screen. It says, okay, this bizarre symbol thing that they typed in here somehow doesn't exist in Helvetica. I'm going to go to the next one on the list. It's not there. Next one on the list. Not there. Next one on the list. Not there. Next one on the list. Oh, hey, it's here. I'll use that one. Or if it gets all the way to the end and it still can't find that symbol, you get the little box or the whatever, right? The thing that your operating system does when it can't find a character. For every single glyph that shows up on screen, it does this. Basically, once I understood this, and I understood inline layout, it's a wonder to me that pages ever render at all. It really is. There's amazing complication. There's so much, you get down to the end of it and Lovecraftian horrors crawl out from between the stars. I don't know, it's crazy. I don't know how they do this. So anyway, Unicode Range lets you sort of bend that by saying, okay, if you hit a character in this particular, at this particular code point, Unicode code point, use this face. And then if it can't find it in that face, then it starts doing the whole fallback thing. So you're kind of throwing in an interrupt in a way. So you can use Unicode Range for things like, hey, I want my ampersands to be way cooler than they are, right? So you can say specifically, for the Unicode code point for ampersand, use this other font face, right? So this is a sort of thing that for a while, when authors wanted to do this, they'd put a span around every single ampersand with a span with a class of amp or something like that. And then in their CSS, they would say, hey, any span with a class of amp, show it in Zapfino or whatever, ITC script. Now you can just use Unicode Range and say, at this code point, do a substitute. Now you can see there's a problem here, right? I kind of gave that one away. Yay, Firefox doesn't support Unicode Range yet. So this is what you get with that particular combination of styles and markup. You can work around this. Not in such a way that Firefox will do exactly what Chrome did, but you can still work around it by throwing in this Unicode Range where you basically say, okay, at the code point that's for the ampersand, which is 26, use Zapfino. And for everything else, right, from 0 to 25 and from 27 to 10 FFFF, use Helvetica. And because Firefox doesn't understand Unicode Range, what it does is it looks at the first one and says, oh, Helvetica should actually be Zapfino. And then it comes to the second one and says, oh, I guess Helvetica should be Helvetica. Well, okay, that's fine. And it uses Helvetica. Whereas Chrome and Safari, WebKit, Unicode Range supporting browsers say, oh, okay, you want me to use Zapfino here, and then you want me to use Helvetica over there. I could have figured that out, but thanks. Okay, whatever. Way to be completist. Okay? So, again, you don't get the awesome ampersands in Firefox. Everything's in Helvetica. But again, nobody's going to mail you to say, what's the deal with the different ampersands, right? They're not going to look at it. Or, well, I mean, your boss might, right? Your boss who wanted the beautiful ampersands in the first place. And then you write them back and you say, yeah, support. But we have the ampersands in Chrome and such, and eventually it'll work in Firefox, so just chill. I'm sure that works with your boss, right? Right. That never works with mine, but what can I tell you? Okay, so you can actually simplify this a bit by changing that second Unicode range to just be the very last code point in Unicode. And that still does what it needs to do for Firefox, and it's still okay for everyone else. And, you know, if you only have one code point, it's not that big a deal, but if you're substituting a bunch of different code points in the first one, you don't want to like fill in all the intervening ranges in the second one. Just assign Helvetica to the very last code point, and then Firefox will be happy, everyone else will be happy, it'll all be good. Okay. Here, what I did was I substituted out single and double quotes, the curly quotes as they're sometimes called, instead of the ampersand. I could have done them both. I could have had a U plus 026, and then comma U plus 2018 to 2019, and comma U plus 21C to 21D. 21C and 21D are the double quotes, I believe, and the 18 and 19 are the singles, even if it's the other way around. This way, I was able to substitute in Georgia curly quotes into Helvetica, which, I don't know, I kind of like, but once again, not a typographer. But it was an interesting thing to do, I thought. Now, Unicode Range is really useful, well, it's even more useful, if you ask me, for things like symbol fonts. This is Iconic, which I particularly like. And the reason for that is that Iconic, unlike most symbol fonts, was designed around the actual Unicode code points that apply. So this is a table of the symbols they support. And if you look at it, what they did was, this shows Iconic next to Helvetica. So 0x2717, that's the check mark right there in the middle. Not the one in the circle, the one above it, right? They said 2717, which is the code point for this particular symbol, that's where we're going to put the symbol in our font. See, most symbol fonts like to substitute A, B, C, and D, and so on with their symbols. So that if, you know, A might be an application icon, and B is a I don't know, whatever. C is a cart, D is a disk icon for those of us who are still using those, right? Which then, like if C is for the shopping cart, then everywhere you want a shopping cart, you type C, and then you use that font, right? And it substitutes in a shopping cart. That's great unless the font doesn't load, and then you have these C's all over your interface. And then you're just like, C, what does that mean? Right? Why is there a little C up here in the toolbar? Where's the shopping cart? Okay? Whereas Iconic takes those sorts of symbols and applies them to the correct code points. So, like I say, most symbol fonts are not this smart. Even smarter is that where Iconic has symbols that don't actually have Unicode code points, and I guess there are 2 or 3 symbols left for that, like document alt fill there at the bottom of the middle column, and calendar, and the entire right column. Those are all in the E000 range, which is the official Unicode range for, here's where you put your symbols that don't have Unicode code points, right? So rather than taking the aperture symbols and assigning them to A and capital A, or tossing them somewhere else in the code in the Unicode space, they put them in this range that's reserved for stuff that isn't covered by the rest of Unicode. Again, most symbol fonts don't do this. Stately is a good example, which has a different states of the United States glyphs, but they're assigned to A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and capital A, B, C, D, E, F, G. They should have, as far as I'm concerned, put them in the E0000 range. But they didn't, so there you go. Now, if you wanted to construct a Unicode range descriptor that covered all of Iconic, all of its code points, it would be a little complicated. Okay, it looks like that. I don't necessarily recommend that. Because you don't really have to, right? If you say that for Helvetica that the first choice is Iconic, and then, well, basically if you say Iconic, comma, Helvetica, then it will use that font resolution mechanism again, right? If you have a shopping cart symbol or What's a good one? If you have an umbrella symbol, because of the weather recently, it's a thing, topical. So if you have an umbrella symbol, and in your font family declaration, in your actual property, you've said, not in the font face, but in the rest of the styles, you said, hey, use iconic, and then use Helvetica, and then use sans serif if you have to. Anytime it sees an umbrella, it will look at iconic first and say, okay, great, umbrella, done. And if you have another symbol that's not an iconic, then it goes to Helvetica, right? Just like that. So, with all these pieces put together, you can actually construct your own custom font faces, right? So, you can call your font family My Font, which seems to be everybody's favorite, as you'll see in a moment, actually, where you say, hey, I'm going to define this font family called My Font, and the base of it will be Helvetica. But then for these particular Unicode code points, I want to use Georgia. And then if the font weight is 100, bring in Zapfino. And then at the end, I'm going to say Unicode Range U plus 10 FFFF, because Firefox needs the help, right? And then you can do this kind of thing. And for the most part, it's not fully consistent, but for the most part, it's consistent. Let me make sure I get the numbers right. Unicode Range U plus 4.1 through 5A. That's in that second little block there. That's all the capital letters in English, at least. So that's how, if you look at the Chrome version, the word do, how does he do it, do, that's in Georgia, because I used Unicode Range to substitute in Georgia anytime there's a capital letter. Except, well, unless the font weight is 100, in which case I got Zapfino, okay? So, for that matter, the capital F in font construction in the first line is also in Georgia. So, maybe not the best idea, but again, try to illustrate something here. And then in Firefox, you get the Zapfino substitution because that works, but then for everything else you get Helvetica because it doesn't understand Unicode Range. So, call your font whatever you want. Call it Steve. It's not going to mind, right? Now, a question that goes along with all of this, and I understand that it is something to be concerned about, is, as I said before, what happens with font loading, right? Because as an example, suppose that I set things up so that I'm defining my own font, and I want to use this particular web open format font file. And I want to restrict it to the lowercase a through z range. And then I say, apply this font to paragraphs. And I only have one paragraph, and that paragraph is completely empty, right? According to, well, you would think, at least, given that the CSS fonts module talks about lazy loading and how the font module tries to, be judicious about what it downloads, that no browsers would download this. In fact, 2 of them do. Those are the guys that are highlighted there. Firefox and Internet Explorer will download that WAF file anyway. I got that from Jake Archibald's Request Quest, which he published recently. It's actually an interesting little quiz. It's basically a trivia quiz about what will trigger server requests and what won't, and in which browsers. And I got just under 50%, mostly by guessing lucky. Because there are plenty of questions where like, hey, there's this crazy situation. Will any browsers request this? You're like, of course they won't. No, yes. What about now? Oh, of course they will. No. Okay. And I will tell you right now, if you're going to take the strategy of just clicking on the same answer every time, click yes, because you'll get 1 point better than if you just click no all the time. Okay? No is the correct answer 19 out of 39 times, and yes is the correct answer 20 out of 39 times. So, yeah. And yet I still managed to score below 50%. Go me. Okay. Which I suppose another way of looking at that is, hey, browsers are acting in such a way that if you think about it sensibly, if you think about the situation sensibly and then answer based on that basis, you will do worse than random chance. Okay. Anyway, so right here I've said, hey, here's this Unicode range. Now, of course, from the previous slides, you would think you might say to yourself, well, of course, Firefox doesn't understand Unicode range, so of course it will download that file. Except the paragraph is empty, right? There's no reason, regardless of the Unicode range, it should have looked at the paragraph and said, you know, this, I'm not ever going to use my font, so why would I download that file? Well, so Chrome and Safari are smart enough not to do this. However, if we take the same paragraph and we throw in some uppercase text, no lowercase, then everybody downloads the file, even though they're never going to use it. So, you know, there's this theory that browsers will be smart about what they need to download. But as has often been said, the difference between theory and practice is a lot further in theory, or is a lot closer in theory than it is in practice. So, my sense, and I can't prove this, but my sense is that this is an outgrowth of the aggressive prefetching that browsers do in order to make web pages more responsive, right? Where you hit a page and some browsers, at least at some points in history, would look at all the pages that that page linked to and start grabbing resources from those pages, because what if you clicked on one of those links, right? And then if you clicked on one of those links, the page would immediately go twink because it had already loaded it in the background, right? And so, well, they used to. That's not the reason. Well, that's not the reason for the font thing? No. Oh, good. Danielle has something to tell me after the talk. Woo! I'll blog the answer if I have to. Otherwise, I'll tweet it if it's short. So, at any rate, all of these browsers will download this file for whatever reason. Okay, so, yeah, there are all these cool tricks and tools, and a lot of them are, you know, only partially applicable. But that's the nice thing, right? This is a perfect example of progressive enhancement, where you can style things the way, you could do things the way you've always done them, right? You have Helvetica all the way through a document, or you have Helvetica and Georgia all the way through a document, or whatever combination of fonts you're using, but then add these little extra touches, right? Substitute in a nicer ampersand. You know, make it so that if you condense the text, you swap in a face that looks like a condensed version of your base font. You know, touches here and there, and then, you know, if someone comes in with Firefox and doesn't understand Unicode range, everything's the way that it would have been anyway. And if they come in with a more advanced browser, or one day, hopefully, a version of Firefox that supports Unicode range, then suddenly everything will be better, right? Everything will be more like what you were trying to do. So I wanted to leave time for questions, and so I'm pretty sure that I've done that. I hope this has been enjoyable, and as I say, if you have any questions, please let me know, and we'll see if Danielle can answer them for you. Okay. It's a little, no, they're going to bring up the house lights so I can see hands. I hope. Okay. Well, if anyone wants to, there we go. Oh, hey, way in the back. I'm lucky I saw you.
Wait for the microphone, please.
Oh, there's a microphone coming. Hang on, just a second.
No.
Sweet.
Hello.
Hi.
You were speaking quite a lot about Firefox and Chrome, but
right.
What's the situation with Internet Explorer, with the descriptors? Is it doing anything at all?
Yeah.
Thanks.
What's the situation? I mean, I'm not going to go through point by point with the talk, but it's up with the other two, maybe not point for point the same. It certainly is, and the most recent versions of Internet Explorer do, you know, they'll at least download the font and apply it, and you can do some of the sort of substitution type stuff. But as with anything, test, right, and make sure that you're doing okay. I'm curious, and you don't have to. Do you still have the mic, or did they take it away already? Oh, they took away the mic already, okay. All right, then I won't ask. But of course, whether or not you need to worry about Internet Explorer actually depends on your site. And I don't know how many Internet Explorer users you have. Like on my personal site, I have hardly any. But this is why I ignore places like Browser Stat or One Browser Market or whatever they're called, right? Where they say the global share of users has, 20% this browser and 30% that browser and 50% this other browser. And you know what? That only matters if I'm responsible for all of the sites that they use to collect those statistics. And I'm not, right? I'm responsible for my sites. And maybe I have a site that's 90% Internet Explorer 8 users, in which case you can ignore everything I just said, right? Or almost everything. It did download fonts, but not much else. Or you might have a site like mine, which is like 3% Internet Explorer users, in which case I can either just say, well, they're going to get the font, or I might say, you know what, I'm going to use a conditional comment to not let them download fonts at all. They can just have the fallbacks, right? So, yeah. But the basics are all pretty much there, unless you're in the situation as someone in my workshop was yesterday, where they're still having to deal with IE6. Yes, please, a moment. Let's pour one out for that poor person, because oh man, IE6 was great. It was a great browser in 2001. Now it's 12 years later, so yeah. But that can happen. I once worked with clients who 15% of their users were on IE5. This was a few years ago, but we were well into the IE8, IE9 era, and 15% of their users were on IE5. That turned out to be 1 million people a month. Whew, yeah. And that was after a day and a half of advanced CSS training. And I just stopped. I was like, why am I even here? They're like, no, it's fine. Because the other 85%, I was like, okay. Anyway, question. Yeah, down here. Awesome.
It's maybe not a question, but in addition to your response, situation with IE9 and 10 is even worse than you may expect.
Oh, good.
Yeah, if you use non-standard font, including Helvetica in CSS, they switch it into compatibility mode. So instead of IE9 or 10, you have immediately IE7.
Yeah.
So you do need some meta tag in your HTML page to force them work in standard mode.
Okay. Yeah. So you need to actually. Can you hand the mic right there? Right there.
This is sort of. I don't know if this is directly related to your talk, but maybe it can help anyway.
Okay.
I work with a company that regularly works with design firms that will use usually about 4 font variants or typeface variants.
Okay.
And this is a requirement of the design. It makes the CSS complex. And then, of course, there is the concern about performance. And can you quantify those performance concerns a little bit? Because it's hard to convince these firms anyway that it's a problem. So is it a problem? And if so, how big is it? And how big a fuss should you kick up as a developer?
Yeah. See, at least half of your problem there is more of a interpersonal problem than a technical problem.
Fair enough.
And I did not get my degree in psychology. However, so, I mean, a lot of it's going to depend on the particular environment. Well, and by environment, I mean, who are they trying to reach? Okay. For example, if you have a design firm, if you have one of these clients who says, we're only doing things on desktop, right? Performance doesn't matter. No one's ever going to want to do what we're doing. Like, no one's ever going to want to visit our site on mobile. Who would ever want to do this on mobile? It's complete. Well, so in that case, the answer isn't, well, performance, right? Because they've already basically written off mobile. You need to get them to stop writing off mobile. Karen McGrain actually has been talking about this recently, and I think her talk is online. It's called the Mobile Content Mandate. I would send that to them, because as Karen points out, no matter what you're doing, someone who says no one would ever want to do that on mobile, I guarantee you someone's already trying to do it on mobile, right? They're already trying to come to your site on mobile. They're trying to do whatever, right? You don't, as a designer, as a developer, as the person helping to create the website, you don't get to tell users no mobile, right? That's up to them. They're the ones who get to decide when they want to do things on mobile. And there was, there was a, Karen makes this analogy between the turnover between mainframes and desktops, right? And people say, why would anyone ever want to do this kind of thing on a crappy desktop, right? Well, they certainly did, right? And we're going through something very similar with mobile. And for lots of people, mobile is their only access to the internet. So even if they don't want to do your thing on mobile, they will anyway because they don't have another alternative. So there's that. And on mobile, performance is always an issue because you don't have the same kind of quad-core, bazillions of gigs of RAM, et cetera, in which to do all of this calculation. But even if you have something that the processor can eventually handle, you're draining battery, and battery is very right? So all of these factors come together. Now, I can't say, if you use 4 fonts, then that's twice as much load as using 3 or whatever, because it depends. Font files can be huge or they can be tiny, and different cellular carriers have different response times and so on and so forth. But to say, for someone to ignore this is roughly akin to someone ignoring different monitor sizes than the size they used to design the page, right? This page best viewed on my computer never worked. It was never a good idea. And it's an even worse idea to say this page best viewed in this particular medium, right? Because that's not going to last. They're basically, to say, we don't want to do this on mobile is dooming your site to being obsolete before it even went out the door. So I would attack it from that angle. Now, if they, if it's this absolutely brand guidelines, lawyers did you put all the stuff there in front of them to say, we've tested this out, right? We have some time. We got a few mobile devices and tested how long it took to do this thing that you wanted. Like it took this long to buy your widget. And we had to go through this many steps, and it was this painful, right? Or better yet, sit them down with a mobile device that they don't actually own and say, okay, do that thing, right? Do your thing. How's that going, right? Don't say anything. Just sit there with a stopwatch. Sit very quietly, impassively, like practice in front of a mirror, stone face, poker. See how long it takes them. And what they have to go through. How far do they have to scroll past the legal whatever, and how long does it take just for a page to come up because their mobile device is trying to load their 4 face variants and so on. And, maybe they might still insist that you do it, in which case you've done your best. Or they might say, yeah, we'll go talk to legal. We'll see if we can get some exceptions for this and that, right? That's about the best I can offer. And I'm curious, do you happen to have a community device lab near you? Do you know what that is? It's okay if you don't. Okay, so community device lab, Jeremy Keith has been talking about this for a while, is so nobody can own all the mobile devices, right? There are thousands and thousands and thousands of different mobile devices now. So a community device lab is somebody in a city, or a few people in a given city if it's large enough, basically put out a call to say, hey, if you've got old mobile devices, old Symbian, whatever, BlackBerry, et cetera, that you're not using anymore, contribute it to this device lab. We'll have all these devices in one place, and then anyone can come in and bring up their page on all of our devices and see how that goes, right? If you have an old Kindle Fire 1 that nobody in your house uses anymore, contribute that, right? The iPad, first gen, et cetera. If you don't have one in your, look for one in your city. If you don't have one in your city, consider starting one, right? Because then you'll have all the devices and other people can come and test, and you can meet other people who are in the field in your area, right? And that way you have the ability with these clients to say, we're going to go to the community device lab and test this out. Come on, let's go. It'll be fun. We'll bring cookies, right? Get them in there and then find out how that goes for them. So that's what I do. Okay. Okay. PPK has told me I have nattered on long enough, so we'll turn it over to the next speaker. Thank you very much.